Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm Pastor Josh. We find ourselves in a unique and unprecedented moment, a global pandemic that's upending every aspect of our lives. As we face these unique pressures from without, I believe we're being faced with a critically important question today. How will we respond? As we face this pressure, we can choose to move either in integration towards wholeness or towards disintegration, further apart from those we love and even from God. Over the course of a 5-week series, the table is exploring this question of how can we find wholeness, and how does our faith invite us towards a more integrated life, even now amid a pandemic. We're looking at the emotional, relational, spiritual, vocational, and even communal aspects of health and wholeness. And I hope you'll join us. You can find all the videos here on Facebook, on YouTube, or even join the conversations on our Zoom channel. Be blessed. Welcome as we get started this morning. If we have not met, my name is Josh Wilson. I live here in Fields Corner and get the awesome privilege of being a pastor here at the table. So just want to say welcome. We're glad that you joined us this morning. I get that our options are somewhat limited, but you could be watching Netflix instead. You could, be sleeping in this morning. There's other ways that you could be investing your time. So if you've chosen to jump on with us this morning, we're grateful for that. And really, our hope and prayer is that it will be a blessing to you as well, that you'll not only experience love or learn something, but that really you'll be resourced to walk away in a position better to find relational wholeness as a result of our conversation today. For those of you who are new to the table, just getting to know us, we are a small but mighty multiracial movement of microchurches. That's a lot of M's. But we are learning to live and love like Jesus and linking arms to extend good news in neighborhoods and networks across our city. That's kind of what we're about here. And there's a place for you here in this community. We'd love to help you find it, to talk to you about what's going on and what that looks like, and what the plan is ahead, both in the pandemic and beyond that. If you're interested in finding out more about the table throughout our conversation today, or just checking us out, really the best way to take a next step towards that is by filling out a Connect card. There's a Connect card that you can find on the website, tableboston.org/connect. That will kind of allow you to share out both information as well as prayer requests, ways that we can be connected to you, that we could serve you, help us take a next step in the conversation, the relationship. I'm also always up for coffee as well, even if it's virtual, and would love to personally have a conversation with you if we have not yet had a chance to meet or have that conversation. So there's an option there to request a coffee with Pastor. And if you just click on that button, we'll find a time probably on Zoom to connect and chat and get to know one another. So this morning we are continuing our series on finding wholeness. It's a 5-week series where we're looking at kind of the emotional, the relational, the spiritual, the vocational, and even the communal dynamics or dimensions of finding wholeness. And this morning we're talking about relationships, looking at how our faith invites us into an emotionally whole and a relationally healthy, integrated way of living, even now, even amid a pandemic, even under social distancing. We may be spending fewer time with people in our day-to-day, and we certainly have some additional pressures and pain points that make some of the relational interactions in our lives perhaps more challenging than they were even before this pandemic. But as I think you'll discover as through the course of this conversation, challenges are also opportunities, and there's some exciting ways that we can be leaning into this in a way that will result in deeper and more intimate relationships on the other side of this. So hope you'll stick with us for this conversation. A little bit later on, we get to interview our dear friends Bill and Paulia Mooney McCoy. They are hi Paulia. Bill and Paulia are neighborhood residents. They live just a couple of blocks away. Been in the neighborhood a long time. I stole a different picture of you guys than the one you sent me, Paulia, because this one just looks so incredibly cute. But among the many things, if I were to give a full bio, it would take a lot of our time this morning. But they've been involved in so many aspects of ministry, so many aspects of community. And of course, at the center of that has been their marriage, which they just celebrated their 40-year anniversary. One of the things that I so appreciate about Bill and Polia is their marriage, just the opportunity to get to see the way that they interact as a couple, and also their family through many of you know Caleb, who's part of the discipleship cohort as well, their son. So really a beautiful legacy of relationship and intimacy that they have been able to cultivate over the years. And so as we're thinking about relationships, we wanted to have them on to share some of the gems that they have unearthed over these decades of life and relating together. So we'll be talking about that just a little bit later in our conversation. But as we really enter this conversation this morning, want to invite us to consider this idea of what happens when we are under pressure. When we are under pressure, as is certainly true for us right now in this moment, we really have an opportunity for what's inside to come outside. Under pressure, we often leak or overflow. You could say, there's an illustration I often use of kind of a bottle overflowing, that when a bottle is squeezed, what is inside the bottle comes outside the bottle. And what is exposed in that moment is not something different than what has already been there. Whatever was in the bottle has been there all along throughout the process. But by virtue of the pressure that has been applied, what is inside comes outside. And I think this is a dynamic that is showing up in many of our relationships right now. It's a dynamic that things that are inside us are being pressed down. They're being put upon by virtue of these unique circumstances and challenges that we're faced with, whether it's a disruption of our normal routines, the inability to be physically present with one another, like we've been talking about this morning, so many other things, so many other pressures we're experiencing right now. It's a tendency to kick up all of these things that are inside of us and actually for us to move those out into our relationships. And this could be a good thing, but I think oftentimes it's a bad thing. Oftentimes what ends up happening is the pain that we experience doesn't become healed, but actually becomes transmitted to other people. Father Richard Rohr talks about it this way. He says, if we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it, usually to those closest to us, our family, our neighbors, our coworkers, and invariably the most vulnerable, our children. That is a bit of an ominous thought, honestly. These are people that, you know, we are in relationship with. They're people that we love, the people who are closest to us. Certainly we want good for them. Most of us don't intend to hurt others, but often when we experience pain, when we experience pressure, if we don't heal that, if it's not transformed, it can be transmitted into those relationships in a way that does damage. This may look like conflict, explicit conflict in our relationships. I've heard from multiple people. Some of you may have seen the images of parents who are trying to work from home with kids duct taped to the wall or duct taped to the floor. I did not pull up that image, but I've seen a couple of those through my screen recently. I know many of us, most of us in Boston, it's too expensive to live by ourselves here, right? So most of us have housemates. And it's so easy in this space where I've heard so many people saying, I've never spent so much time with my housemates. Like they're everywhere, right? Small spaces, confined quarters have become that much smaller, that much more confined as we rub shoulders and bump elbows more than perhaps we did before the pandemic. But even as we're in proximity, these tensions can create relational distance. Whether that means that we're just ignoring somebody, kind of holding them at arm's length, not engaging the conversation, whether that's explicit fights or arguments, all of these things can show up in our relationships. Irritation, anger, loneliness, distance, coldness. So just over the next couple of minutes, as we get started here this morning, I'd like to invite us to take a moment to really just reflect on what has been leaking out? What has been overflowing into the relationships in your life over these past couple of weeks? Have you been moving towards integration or disintegration? And if disintegration, away from the wholeness that we're seeking and attempting to find, how is that showing up in your relationships with others? So we're going to throw a slide up on the screen here. What signs of relational disintegration in the way you're relating to others are you noticing? What signs, perhaps it's sometimes easier to see in others, what signs of relational disintegration are you noticing in the way others are relating to you, perhaps? But just take a minute to inventory, to consider what is showing up in your life in this season when we're all experiencing a lot of pressure. As you continue to reflect for a moment, if there's something that is striking for you, feel free to drop that in the chat. Thanks to those who are sharing. I know that I've personally certainly noticed just more shortness sometimes in my relationships, especially with Allie, a tendency to avoid as well. Man, we are experiencing a lot right now in terms of pressures from without. It would be easy for these things to spill over. So this morning, as we continue on, we want to turn to Scripture to explore how this dynamic shows up in our relationship and what possibilities might be there for us. I suggested earlier that this pressure, even the pain that we're experiencing, has the potential not only to push us away from others, but actually to potentially pull us together. And I think this possibility is something that we see in a lot of places, but particularly in the story of Joseph. For those of us here at the table, the Scripture is an amazing guide. It's an invitation to really think about life, and this story that we see in the life of Joseph really illustrates two contrasting alternatives, two different possibilities, and gives us some wisdom around how we might respond, I think, even in this current moment. So this story we first see in the book of Genesis. We're going to pick up this morning in Genesis chapter 37. If you have a Bible, Genesis chapter 37, you can turn there in the text. But to give you a bit of backstory as we dive in this morning, Joseph, the main character in our story today, was part of a big family. Really a famous family, probably one that you have heard of or know of. His dad was kind of a big deal. He was a guy named Jacob, also known by the name of Israel. And of course, Israel is a familiar name for us. Israel had, the character in the Bible, had 13 sons, which ultimately ended up working out to be the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, a familiar reference point for many of us. But many of you are just thinking at this point, holy crap, 13 sons? That's, I mean, many of you have a few kids running around the house right now, and you're imagining, can you think, what would it be like to have 13 boys in the house? Oh my gosh, that must have been one crazy household, right? But to make matters even substantially more complicated, Israel's children, these 13 boys, came by 4 different women. And this family was complicated. It was a messy situation. You could see here on this kind of third line, the long axis, which is probably too small to read, but you could see Israel or Jacob there. And then you see 1, 2, 3, 4 different women and the different children that came by each of them. If that wasn't complicated enough, Jacob, or Israel, played favorites. He preferred Joseph's mom, Rachel, over his first wife, Leah, we find in Genesis 29 and verse 30. As a result, in all of these different ways, Israel treated Joseph better than his brothers. In Genesis 37, we read, that Israel had Joseph, who was only 17 at the time, playing manager to his brothers in the family business. Not cool, Dad. Israel gives Joseph stuff that his brothers don't get. So as you can perhaps imagine, what happens when siblings, when parents play favorites? Well, resentment happens. And that's exactly what we see. In Genesis 37 and verse 4, we read, when his brothers saw their father loved him, that is Joseph, more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Maybe you can feel this, imagine this, even in somebody who is frustrating to you, somebody who drives you crazy. The difficulty to even say a single kind thing to them. This is how Joseph's brothers felt about him. And to make things even worse, Joseph had visions of grandeur. Not metaphorically, like literally visions of grandeur. God sent him prophetic dreams in which Joseph saw his entire family bowing down to him. So what happens when what does this 17-year-old punk do with these prophetic dreams? He goes and tells all of his brothers and even his parents that he sees this vision in which they're all going to be bowing down to him. Can you imagine? He says in Genesis 37, verse 6, listen to this dream I had, and then goes and recounts the whole thing to him. As you might have predicted, we read just 2 verses later in Genesis 37, verse 8, that his brothers are displeased. They say, the text tells us that they hated him all the more because of his dreams and what he'd said. Now, for just a second here, I'd like for us to pause and just imagine, can you put yourself in the position of the brothers? I mean, this has got to be a pretty uncomfortable, pretty painful situation. Their dad prefers their brother to him, or to them. And it shows up in all sorts of these different ways, in responsibilities in the family business, in specific perks and gifts that he gets. I'm sure every time that one of these things occurred, that they just felt a little stab of being passed over, almost a feeling of rejection. And then to make matters worse, their arrogant little prick of a brother exults in his elevated status. This all had to be terribly hurtful. And we see in the story that their pain isn't processed, it isn't healed, as we thought about in the quote earlier. Instead, it metastasizes. It grows. And it results in anger and blame and hatred. I can imagine that they were jealous, that they were resentful. One thing leads to another, and in chapter 37, we read that the experience results in a response. Joseph's brothers plot together to murder him. And although they don't end up actually going through with the murder, they do end up selling him off as a slave to Midianite traders. Talk about a dysfunctional family. The Bible does not pull any punches here. And this is why I point us to this story this morning. See, while Joseph's brothers go much further, certainly, than we do most of the time, I think if we look closely, we can see a pattern that their actions reveals that maybe even shows up in our interactions with our housemates, in our interactions with our spouses, in our interactions with our coworkers. See, Joseph's brothers are confronted with a painful experience, something that's deeply challenging. In this case, it's their father's preference for Joseph and Joseph's subsequent superiority to them. And they move from that into action intended to somehow control the situation, to fix the situation, to resolve this. They do this by attacking the one that they blame for their suffering, by transmitting their pain onto him, by trying to take him out of the equation so that perhaps they can get back to this relationship with their father that they might have hoped for. But we see not only in this story of Joseph, the brothers' interaction with him, but we also see a second response. And this is really where this story is incredible. Because we also see how Joseph responds. Not only how the brothers have an experience and respond, but how Joseph has his own experience and respond. And many of you know the story. Joseph ends up traded by the Midianites to people in Egypt. He becomes a slave there. And he has a terrible string of luck, frankly, that continues, ultimately landing him in jail due to a false accusation. Everything that could go wrong in this guy's life seems to go wrong. But even in prison, we read in Genesis chapter 39, verse 21, that the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor with the prison warden, we read. This could be a whole sermon unto itself. I don't have time for this morning, but how many of us would consider it favor of God when we were in prison? I think this upends all sorts of ideas and notions of what God's favor actually looks like. But the Lord's presence was with Joseph, maybe not the way he wanted, maybe not the blessing he was hoping for, but even in the midst of crisis, even in the midst of isolation, the favor of God was with him. Man, it is weirdly quiet on Zoom, probably because you are muted, but there needs to be some hollers and some amens out there. I'm telling you, this is a moment, this is a word, I think, for us, even in isolation, even in suffering, that the Lord is with us. His favor can rest on us. But that's just bonus material there. As we continue to read, we track along in the story, we see that Joseph continues to have these visions. And one night, the king of Egypt, as it turns out, has been having a rough time with sleep as well. He's been having some weird dreams, maybe like pandemic dreams. I don't know. I hear that's a thing too. But the Pharaoh is having some kind of dreams out here. He's beset by these awful dreams that he can't make sense of. And somebody says, hey, there's a guy rotting in prison who has this ability to interpret dreams. He has visions. He might be able to hook you up. So sure enough, the king calls to Joseph. And Joseph, under this divine favor, is able to interpret the king's dream and actually predict a famine that's coming. As a result of the wisdom that Joseph displays, he's exalted, elevated to a position of great authority in the kingdom. So when the famine eventually arrives in Egypt, we find Joseph in a position of authority and his brothers, now years later, coming to him for food. My, how the tables have turned. No longer powerless, Joseph now holds all the cards. And all these years later, in Egyptian garb, in Egyptian cultural dress, on a throne, Joseph's brothers don't even recognize him. But Joseph certainly recognizes his brothers. So now, in this moment, Joseph has the opportunity for a perfect payback. Can you imagine? If your family hated you so much that they literally sold you into slavery, and then the perfect opportunity came along for you to get back, how would you respond? How might you react to this situation? I mean, because if the brothers had a legitimate gripe, if they had reason to feel betrayed and slighted by their father, how much more had Joseph been betrayed? If the brothers had lost out on gifts or responsibility because of Israel's prejudice for Joseph, how much more had Joseph lost out? The brothers had a legitimate grievance here, but how much more so with Joseph? Isn't it true that so often, friends, we blame others as though they were responsible for our actions? Do you know what I mean? It's like sometimes I hear people saying, sometimes I myself am saying, well, I was short, but how do you think I was going to respond after you were critical all afternoon? Or you want me not to take a tone? Well, how about you start cleaning up after yourself in the kitchen? So many times we say statements like this that justify our response by putting that blame, by shifting it onto another person. We attribute our actions to their actions. This is only natural. But when we do this, when we blame our attitudes and actions on other people's behavior, we enter a loop that actually does not serve us well at all. Because it's a two-step process. It's experience and then it's response. Experience and then response. You were critical, I'm short. You left crap in the kitchen, I'm gonna take a tone. You sold me into slavery, you're gonna get your comeuppance, right? 1, 2. But In this process, when we move directly from experience to response, we have no agency. Really, we are victim of our experiences. Other people's actions determine our reactions, and so on and so forth. We're stuck in an unending loop. But friends, I think there's good news, and good news that we see in the story of Joseph, because there is a different possibility available to us this morning. And I love how another overcomer puts it. Viktor Frankl, a psychologist who made sense of his life in the forge of Nazi Holocaust, in the laboratory of his experience in the death camps of Auschwitz, says, between stimulus, between experience and a response, there is a space. There is a space. And in that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our happiness. Oh, friends, there is a space. Our agency exists at this moment between stimulus and response, between experience and reaction. Sometimes the space is but a sliver. But in this space, we have the ability to choose a story. Between experience and response, there is story, and often overlooked but powerful. We can choose a different story. I want you to notice the story that we see Joseph choosing here in Genesis chapter 45. Because, friends, this is everything. This is the difference between Joseph's brothers and Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Did you catch that? God sent me ahead of you. Instead of attributing the actions to the brothers, although he acknowledges what they did, Joseph lives from a bigger story. He's able to step back and say, actually, you meant this for bad, but God is still in control. And this shows up all over Joseph's conversation. Chapter 47, if you have your Bibles, verse 7, we see Joseph say, "God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth." Chapter 45 and verse 8, "So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Chapter 45, verse 9, "God has made me Lord over all Egypt." Chapter 50, verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Over and over and over, the text points us to the story that was driving Joseph's response. And it wasn't what his brothers did. See, Joseph had dialed back. He had pulled back from this action reaction, from the stimulus response. And he had found the opportunity for a better story in between the stimulus and response that would have driven him so quickly and so easily to responding in revenge. This week, our Fields Corner Microchurch had the opportunity to hear from, we're going through this process of sharing out a story each month. And this last week on Thursday, Micaiah shared with us kind of her journey. And one of the things that, if you missed it, you missed it. But one of the things that stood out to me was she said that as she looked over some pain, some heartache, some difficult experiences, just seeing how God was actually with her the whole time. That's powerful. That's what we see here in the story of Joseph. A different story. And instead of moving from experience directly to response, we see this pattern transformed really into a cycle that opens up all sorts of possibility. Instead of the experience of betrayal and hurt being the defining thing for Joseph, there's a story that's present. God's still in control. God meant it for good, even if they didn't. And that opens up a different response, a different possibility. Joseph doesn't deny the evil that happened to him. He doesn't minimize or pretend it isn't there, but he roots into a bigger story and moves in a way that ultimately blows my mind. See, whenever we're under pressure like this bottle, typically when we experience pain, when we experience pressure, it explodes out into action, right? Reaction. There's no space oftentimes between our stimulus and our response. But for Joseph, all of this pain, all of this pressure generates emotion, but do you notice what he does with it? Instead of moving into reaction, into anger, instead of attacking his brothers, he feels the emotion and the hurt, but he allows it to pull his brothers towards him. In verse 45, in chapter 45, verse 4, which we already read, Joseph says to his brothers, "Come close to me. Come close to me." And then in, again, chapter 45, verse 15, we read that Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept over them. He still feels the emotion, the hurt, but instead of allowing it to push them away, he pulls them close. Instead of transmitting his pain to others, Joseph transforms his pain. He allows God to heal him and to use that emotion as glue to connect him to people that would not have been imagined, that didn't feel possible before. I mean, it kind of makes sense. When we see Joseph inviting his brothers into all his feelings, all these emotions, we see a pattern that still plays out today. Oftentimes, greatest intimacy is generated in the moments of these deepest feelings. Just think about weddings, funerals, right? Whether it's deep joy or deep suffering, these are the moments that bind us together, that connect us deeply. The result is intimacy. So friends, this morning we find ourselves in a season of really unprecedented, for many of us, pressure, for some of us, pain. The circumstances of our lives are acting as a bit of a vice, a furnace that is going to kick up things in us. And I know for many of us, we're seeing that happen. But when we look at our relationships, how is that pressure going to drive us? What stories are we inserting between the stimulus and the response? How will you move in response to these things? Will the pain and the pressure of this moment push you away from the people in your life? Or might this moment actually be the thing that pulls you into deeper community, into deeper intimacy with yourself, with others, and even with God? All right, as we continue this conversation this morning, I'm excited to have my friends Bill and Paulia share with us some of their wisdom. I mentioned them up front. If you joined us since then, Bill and Paulia know a lot about relationships. In some ways, just from doing life and doing it well. I get to serve on a board together with Paulia, and have just gotten the opportunity to know them through the course of a number of different events here in the neighborhood. And one of the things that I so appreciate, as I mentioned before, is their relationship with one another and the way I see them relating with others in our community as well. So I'm gonna, let me see if I can figure out, I'm unmuting you guys, so you're hot mic there. And I'd love to just ask a few questions to interview you guys and to allow you to share some of your wisdom about relationships with us here today. So Bill and Paulia, to get us started, I imagine there have been some times in your life, in your relationship even, when various hurts, losses, disappointments have threatened to pull you guys apart. And I'm wondering if you might share a little bit about maybe one or a couple of those experiences, and what have you found that has allowed you to move through them without allowing them to become a wedge between you?
Well, we've never had any disappointments or hurts or losses, so I don't even know how we can answer.
Yeah, it's just very simple. She's always right. That's it. So I guess there'd be, I mean, in terms of our relationship, I think one of the key things has always been the recognition that we're on the same team, and that's been a refrain from pretty much the beginning. And so much, no matter how incredibly convinced I am that she's dead wrong, I've been able to pull back and say, wait a minute, we are both ultimately trying to live our lives for God and for each other. And having that as a bottom line has just really helped a lot. And that helps not just with our relationship, but other relationships as well. Just to recognize this is not my enemy.
Mm.
Paul says we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, and that's a real case in point. So that I think has just been, and we'll just remind ourselves in the midst of our heated battles, oh, we're on the same team. So we should not be fighting at each other, but with each other toward a goal together.
And I think, and this may go into some other questions that you might ask, but I think to have a commitment to repentance and forgiveness, I think that is just key in terms of the getting through those really difficult times. I mean, Josh, you said, watching our relationship and all that. I'm like, whose relationship is this he's been watching? But I mean, we've had some real difficult times, but it really it's been about being able to say, I'm sorry, sincerely, please forgive me, and to be able to offer forgiveness, even though it can be really painful. One thing that really strikes me about Joseph's story is that there is a point in that story where Joseph says, I want everybody out of the room. Just everybody get out. I just need I need a moment. And then he weeps so loudly that everybody in the household, the servants, everybody knows this man is going through. And so, sort of being able to sort of face pain, but to be able to offer, forgiveness in the midst of that, I think that's really helped us to get through. And I think it's the same with friendships. It's the same with your roommate. It's the same with, people on your job. It's being able to sort of face pain around it, but then offer forgiveness. And that's like the glue that can bring a relationship kind of back together, bring healing.
That's so good. One thing that's occurring to me is even this thing that you referenced, Bill, around just being on the same team. I know there's a refrain that comes up in Allie and my conversations sometimes. We have to remind each other of that because we have a tendency to forget in the heat of an argument. And I'm wondering when you begin to sense that either you or the other person has lost that memory of the fact that we're on the same team, when we've kind of begun to believe perhaps that actually we're enemies here, right? How do you guys find your way back to that in relationship?
Well, I think it's not always easy. And it often requires some direct and difficult conversations that I am not a confrontational person. I hate those.
But I am. So there you have it.
Yeah.
God blesses us with people we need.
Yeah. And I think one of the blessings is that both of us are just so committed to this relationship and to relationships as a whole that we do find a way to find our way back. One other thing that is kind of related is often the thing that we're fighting about is absolutely not the thing we're fighting about. Case in point, a week ago, Paulia asked me a question, and I heard the question as another question that she didn't ask and got extremely defensive about the question she didn't ask and shut down over a question she never asked. And it took me a good 28 to 48 hours to realize she never asked that question. And to recognize that I had a bunch of feelings about that question, and that was all me. And then to have the courage and honesty to say, hey, this is what I was reacting to, and what you asked was completely appropriate. I'm sorry I shut down. But to start to, and that also applies not just for our marriage, but with relationships with other people too. A lot of times I could remind you of somebody else that you have unfinished business with. And so I come in relationship with you, and somehow you are actually, I am triggering memories of something that has nothing to do with me. A few years, my favorite example, I was involved in Living Waters Healing Prayer Ministry, and we had a small group. And one of the members in the small group was just having trouble with everybody. And then one day he suddenly realized, you remind me of my father, you remind me of my mother, you remind me of my pastor. And I have unfinished business with all of them, and I've been relating to all three of you as if you were those people. And as soon as he figured out that you're not those people, he became one of the most critical and vital members of the group. But he had to figure out that he was bringing these agendas to this group that had nothing to do with who was sitting in the room with him. So that's another thing that often helps to get us back, is to realize there's something else going on here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my wife is. Polly, did you have something to add there?
No, not really. No.
My wife is messaging me privately in the chat saying, "This never happens to us." with
It's
more
just
than
us.
sarcasm. Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. I think that just connects with even what we're talking about in when we haven't really taken the time to heal, maybe to Paulia's point, to get away and to weep and to wail such that all the attendants and servants are hearing, right? That it becomes kind of inevitable that we transmit these things onto other people in our lives. You talked about kind of leaning in and engaging some of the unfinished business. I'm curious, beyond maybe the repairing of conflict or issues, what are some keys that you found to just actually like positively cultivating relational wholeness that has helped you guys over the years?
Well, I think it's, sort of sharing values, right? And of course, our highest value is our relationship with God. And so I'm kind of putting that first, and just sharing that is something that I think is been, that draws us, continually draws us forward, draws us together, draws us upward. I think communication is key. That is just key, to learn how to really communicate and to bring your whole self to that space. I think something you said, Josh, just about this, like this whole Zoom call, but you mentioned being present, the whole thing about presence. And I think that that's just really important. And to learn the other person, to learn how they communicate, how they receive and give, communication. That is so important. I'll just say one little quick thing about that is that I have no problem jumping into a conversation and just, talking somebody's ear off. I don't have any problem doing that. Josh can probably testify for our conversations. And I don't have, that much trouble sort of being honest or being sort of upfront. Bill is not that way. Bill is sort of slower to enter in and needs space for that. And it is really taken me pretty much 40 years to figure that out. But it's giving that other person space and understanding how they communicate and being able to listen well. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we really, I think, cultivated in terms of our relationship, and I think it's good across the board, a sense of humor. Not to take yourself so seriously, but to really have Be ready to laugh. Find things that make both of you laugh. As friends, I have a best friend. There's memories that we have that we bring up that just make us, dissolve into laughter. So I think that, and the Bible talks about laughter being like medicine. And I think it's like medicine in relationships. It heals, it refreshes, it mends, And so I think that's really key. Yeah. Yeah. I was hangry yesterday. I hadn't had breakfast. Bill said something. I just yelled. I just screamed. I just screamed at him. and he didn't take it. He didn't take it personally. He said something funny. I forget what he said. I think he might have just yelled back in the same voice that I was using. And it just broke everything. It just made us laugh at the whole thing. So.
Oh man. That's so great. I think there's so much deep wisdom just even in the things I hear you guys sharing. There really is. It does start from this what Bill you were talking about around just recognizing and kind of being committed to the fact that we're on the same team, to have that kind of trust, to allow for the self-awareness and the self-reflection, to even be aware of the stories that we may be making up and enter in to move towards one another, to do things like engage in humor. This is really beautiful. Some great tips to a healthy relationship here. One more just quick lightning round question for both of you that was not scripted, so you guys are on the hot seat here. But I'm curious. So this is a weird space, right? Weird moment of life when our relational dynamics look very different than typically are the case for many of us. What are some keys that you guys are finding right now that are helping you stay alive and stay whole relationally with one another or with kind of other people who are important to you?
I think taking time to check in. We've been trying to take a walk every day, something we should have been doing before this happened. But we've actually been able to do that. We've also spent more time with our extended family than we have in years. Later today, we're going to get on a Zoom and talk to our daughter in Baltimore and my brother-in-law in Calgary. We could have done that all this time. We never did. And now we're doing it every week. And so that, I think, has been a key, is to take time to be together.
I think also, both of us are home. We're both working from home. Just like people are with their roommates and their, significant others. And children, yeah.
We had those ones.
We did have those ones, right? They're gone, yay! But I think the thing again about space, giving each other space. Even if you're in a little tiny apartment or if you're in a house or whatever, I think it's good to have time to come together and check in, but also to have time, where you're apart and you can have some space. Because I think sometimes right now we're all kind of cooped up together and we might feel like we have to be in each other's faces all the time. And I think, to be able to have a little space is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bill and Paulette, thank you so much. I think this is a gift, a resource. There's many more questions that we could and probably should ask. But just for sake of time, we're going to kind of continue on in our conversation. And we're actually going to move into a time of reflection, and we're going to throw some questions up here on the screen that give us some space to just reflect. So if you've got those journals, go ahead and do that. You're welcome to answer in the chat if you'd like, or just personally. Keep your answers to yourself if you prefer. So continue to consider as you look at these questions here, which are coming up on the screen. Friends, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up our time this morning. Of course, we many of us are connected, and we'll keep these conversations going. Invite you to continue to reflect on these things, even in the week ahead. As we wrap up this morning, just want to highlight a couple of things for you that I believe will be a help. Again, at the top, I mentioned there's an opportunity to get connected. We want to stay connected with each of you. We are actively praying for people in the community. So if there's a specific request, let us know. If there's ways that you'd like to get involved, you can let us know through the Connect card on tableboston.org/connect. I would also would love to invite you to give. We are a community that is currently in startup mode. Most of our generosity comes from outside sources at this point, but our growing community is also giving to the mission to help create microchurches, communities of people who live and love like Jesus and are linking arms to serve their neighborhood. This is definitely a get to, not a have to. There's no pressure. If you're just checking us out today, again, just welcome. We're glad that you're here. But if you've gotten value this morning, if this is something you believe in and are excited about, we'd be happy for you to support by way of generosity. And you can do that again at the website, tableboston.org/give. Last but probably even more important, I'm so excited. Next week we're continuing our series on finding wholeness amid a pandemic, and we're diving into a conversation about our spiritual lives. How do we as Christians, as followers of Jesus, cultivate spiritual wholeness in this space of pandemic? So I hope you'll join us again for that conversation. It'll be at 10 a.m. Same Zoom link you used today, or same place on the Facebook page there. And finally, I just want to flag for you this Thursday, once a month right now, our Fields Corner Microchurch is hosting a Discovery Bible Study opportunity for us to really explore and engage Scripture together as a community. This coming Thursday, we're going to be looking at a Psalm of Lament. Again, lament is a practice that we've been engaging as a community, and I believe will serve us. I'm excited to dig into this text together and really discover what it might have by way of significance for us in this moment. So you can find that information on Facebook, details for joining the call on Facebook, or on our website at tableboston.org, but would love to have you or someone you know join us for that conversation. It'll be really interactive and a fun time together on Thursday. Well, as we wrap up this morning, again, want to say thank you for being with us, for participating. We're going to close with a benediction.
Right, I invite you to close your eyes or lower your gaze and extend your hands in a posture of receiving this benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May you have the spaciousness of spirit to slow down and the discernment to notice the secret stories that drive your responses. May you have the courage to choose responses of love over reactions from fear. May you find in Christ healing that transforms your pain so that it is transmitted no longer. May the Lord bless your family, friends, and all those you love, so that the pressures and pains, even in a pandemic, might bring you together rather than driving you apart. Dear friends, I bless you this morning in the strong, the beautiful, the healing name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Go in peace. Amen.